Hey, I'm Taylor Dorsett, and this is the Professional Technical Interviewee. Technical interviews are hard, and every company does them differently. On this show, I interview engineering leaders to see what they look for in technical candidates, and then they perform a real technical interview with me. I hope you enjoy.
Cool. Great. Well, Ross, welcome to the show. How are you? Happy Friday.
Yeah, doing good. Happy Friday to yourself.
Thank you. The guest today is Ross Bell, currently an engineering manager at Elastic, based out of Chicago here. And previously, you were senior engineering manager, VP of engineering, CTO, founder of a whole bunch of companies in the Chicagoland area over the last handful of years. Did I miss anything there? Anything else you want to mention?
No, only that I'm located in Chicago, as are a number of folks at Elastic, but Elastic itself is globally distributed. We like to think of it as remote native, or I think that's the buzzword of the day.
Yeah, I love it. Can you share a little bit about Elastic and kind of what your team does there?
Yeah, absolutely. Most folks probably know of Elastic as the stewards and maintainers of Elasticsearch, search database technology that I would say most technology platforms either use Elasticsearch or something very similar to it. Mm-hmm. The team I get to work with at Elastic, I think we're technically the enterprise search team, but we deal with search experiences, a search bar at the top of your website or in your mobile app, and also ingestion. And so when you want to search across data, that data isn't just magically in your Elasticsearch data store. How'd you get it there? And whether it's coming from your Postgres database or your MongoDB data store, or maybe it's internal search for your company, and you want to expose search across all your GitHub issues and all your Jira tickets and stuff like that. The ingestion team within Enterprise Search builds all the tooling to help you get data into Elasticsearch.
Nice. That's cool. That's a piece of it I haven't even thought of. That's probably a lot of work and probably really interesting depending on the client, right? You have to go in and be like, okay, what do you even have? And then how do we help you get this into a searchable space, right?
And in addition to that, kind of having to fake it till you make it as experts and every possible data source that comes along. I wish I knew more about SharePoint Online, because a lot of people want to get their SharePoint Online data into Elasticsearch. And Azure is a big ecosystem, and I could never possibly know enough to be an expert there. That's something. If you want to come work with the team and you know a lot about SharePoint Online, get in touch.
I love it. Cool. Can you share a little about your pathway into technology? Did you go the traditional computer science route or some other route, or what's that look like?
Yeah, nothing too unique there. I was a computer science undergrad in Nebraska. I think what might be unique there was that I had some awesome comp sci programs available to me in high school, and so I was writing Visual Basic in my sophomore year of high school, which I've now learned, for my era was kind of unique. I think the other thing I got to take advantage of was I went to University of Nebraska at Omaha. Most people know about Nebraska at Lincoln for football, but at the time, Omaha was considered a commuter school, kind of, in a negative light. But that meant I got to have year-round internships every year, which was amazing. When I graduated college, I got to go out to prospective employers and say, hey, I've had, it's not a full-time job, but I've had 3 solid years of internships at this point. I know how to write SQL. I know my way around. At the time, the editor I was using was Eclipse. That I realized was unique compared to other graduates of the time. And then from there, there was just a full-time job, one after another in my 20s. And I suppose the other unique thing about Omaha is there's a lot of Department of Defense contracting companies out there.
Interesting.
And so there are a lot of software engineering opportunities out in Omaha, more than you'd expect given the metro area and what people think Omaha might be like.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I love that kind of being able to intern year round. The first company I worked at, we had a number of, we call them interns, but essentially they were engineers who worked for us full time, but just when it was the school year, they worked, part-time, right? They do 10 hours a week or something. But during the summers, they basically work full-time with us. And those engineers knew the code base far better than I did when I'd been there 6 months, and I was like, how do you know so much? Because I've been here 3 years, right? It's just
Yeah.
kind of, my schedule fluctuates. And I think they had a huge leg up when they started to actually, when they looked for, a lot of them stayed at that company once they graduated. But then even if they looked for a job afterwards, it looked a little weird on the resume because it's kind of like this extended internship. But I think basically they came in as like a very skilled early career engineer or like a mid-level engineer right away, right out of school, which I think was really helpful and not necessarily something a lot of people think of. If you think like, oh, I get an internship for 6 months, then or 3 months, and it looks good on the resume, right?
I mean, the typical 3-month summer internship, you've just gotten started, and it's time to pack your stuff and go back to school.
Yeah.
As a prospective employer, when I see folks who graduate school and I can tell they've dealt with real software engineering project problems, it's the stuff that isn't that exciting, but they worked through it. That's very valuable from my perspective.
Well, and has worked with the team with like whatever. There's just something to be said for like the software you have to use, to work within a team, whatever it's Jira or GitHub, Zenhub, whatever it is. Like just knowing that stuff gives you a leg up, right? Of like, oh, you know how to manage like work with tickets, right? Versus like, oh, here's a task, do it and come back to me when you're done, right? It's a whole different world.
Yeah. And to understand the value of frequent updates to a ticket, that's something that's obvious in hindsight, but it takes a while for folks to get used to.
Yeah, totally. Well, can you share a little bit about how you ended up in this current role at Elastic?
Yeah, so take yourself back to I want to say June of 2020. Weird time for the world. The pandemic had been around for a few months by then, and I think folks still weren't quite sure where the world was headed. Anyways, all this to be said, interestingly, I think that moment in time, we're trying to figure out our pathway to owning a house and trying to figure out what a family meant to us, kind of existential, lifelong questions like that. And so I decided, you know what, it's time for me to go be a senior software engineer at Elastic. I had spoken with the team about a year prior to then, and I love the people I got to meet. The opportunity just didn't work out at the time, but in June of 2020, I thought I need to kind of ease off the gas in my own career, get back into just writing code, and it was an awesome opportunity. I was apprehensive at first about going to a fully distributed company where there would be no office where all of my coworkers worked in, but it was June 2020. We were all working from home.
Sure.
And I always joke with folks that the best compensation to stress ratio job in the entire world is senior software engineer. You cannot get any better than that.
Sure.
If you're trying to optimize for comp and stress. So it was the right time for that era of my life. And then since then, I've moved back into the hot seat of managing teams and dealing with the problems that are contained in there.
What's the Goodfellas line? Like, I keep trying to get out, but they drag me back in.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we were talking before we started, right? At one point, we worked in the same WeWork. And that was when you were at a company that you had helped found. So you went from kind of this co-founder role, which, I'm sure doing a lot of different things and maybe writing some code when you could, right? Versus like going, okay, well, I want to go into this individual contributor role and at a, Elastic kind of Fang adjacent type company, right? That's very well known, and I'm assuming very different type of compensation structure than if you're helping found a company. So that's really an interesting kind of shift.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I was writing a lot of code at that startup. But you're right. Some days I was chief architect of the startup, and other days I was sales associate. It's a very different vibe going from a small startup to a company like Elastic.
Yeah. Have you done interviews lately for your team?
Yeah. We frequently open new roles, and so when I first showed up at Elastic, I was generally participating in coding exercise interviews. Lately, it's been more interviews where we might talk about project management, or where I might be looking for a little more behavioral assessment, less coding skills, more working as a team skills.
Got it. That was going to be my next question: is what area or what part of the interview do you typically focus on? But it sounds like you've done both, but now more so on the, let's figure out if you're a good fit for the team rather than let's figure out if you have the coding skills.
Yeah, exactly. Although I can still go back and forth between either.
Yeah, great. What are you typically evaluating for when you're maybe you can speak to both sides? When you have someone in the technical interview or the behavioral, what are you typically looking to get out of that to see if they're a good fit?
Yeah, we can start with technical. I want to see that this person can write code, and they don't need to be, the best programmer I've ever seen, but I want to see how they tackle a problem that they may not have considered before. In a technical interview, I never want to trick somebody or throw a riddle at them. I want to see them at their best. And so it turns out that that's really hard. And I tell folks that in a good technical interview, the interviewer might be more exhausted by the end of the interview than the interviewee. And that's because it's a lot of work to really suss out that coding ability from a candidate, spot when they're running into arbitrary roadblocks that really don't tell me anything about the candidate and help them move past that, and give them an opportunity to surface as much of their ability to me as possible. On the behavioral side of things, if I tried to boil it down, I'm not too interested in what it's like to work with somebody when everything's perfect. I'm more interested in what it's like to work with somebody when maybe requirements are vague, or it's been a long-running project with some stumbles to it. If we want to ship a week from now and we just got a requirement change, how do they feel about that? They should feel stressed. Everybody should feel stressed about that. That's the normal way to feel. But what do you do with that stress? What do you do during that week? I'm trying to get a feel, or just a small taste for how that person might be to work with when things aren't going perfectly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. How are you framing those questions? Is it basically saying, hey, have you been in the situation in the past and can you tell me about that? Or, and I'm assuming you're not, simulating that on a call, right?
Yeah. No, you're right. I tend to go back and forth between tell me about a time when questions and then proposing a hypothetical situation and asking what the candidate might do. I don't like to rely solely on tell me about a time questions, because some folks, it's up to what have they encountered in the last 6 months of their life. Anything further back than 6 months, they're just not going to remember, and we're not going to have a very useful conversation. So then when I start to sense that, then we'll talk through some hypotheticals, and it's not as useful when you're talking about a real situation that has happened to them recently, but it still gets at the right stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned in a technical interview, trying to be aware of the fact of, if they're stuck, right? Is this some arbitrary issue that is basically not important to you versus the actual crux of the problem, or what you're actually looking to learn about them? How do you gauge that? Is that just, okay, they clearly don't know the syntax, so let's just share that with them, or point them in the direction of that, or what are you looking for to kind of tell the difference between those two? So I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, you're right. It's first off, I want to make sure they understand the question. And so I try to give them, 2, 3, as many outs as they need to ask clarifying questions. If that's certainly the most important base part. And then, I just don't care if they're stumbling over something that I would have to Google myself. I'm Googling things every day if I'm writing code. There's nobody knows how to do that stuff off the top of their head for 8 hours straight. And then if I can tell, I get stuck on technical problems all the time, and I might ask for somebody to rubber duck with me, or pair with me in my editor. And so I'll look for those moments during a coding exercise where maybe I can provide that same little boost, little amount of support just to get us past something. Because if we spend 30 minutes just banging our head against the exact same problem, I didn't learn anything as an interviewer. And the sad truth is that if I learn nothing during an interview, my default decision has to be no hire, and that's a bummer. It's a waste of everybody's time. I'd love to have a confident decision by the end of the interview.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Can you walk me through the interview process, kind of what the steps are for your team?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll try and keep it, high level enough not to reveal anything folks will be upset with me for revealing. But with Elastic, we have an awesome recruiting team we get to work with. That's kind of new for me. I haven't generally worked with companies as large as Elastic is. So I get to rely on resources like that. It's been great. So first step is usually you're probably talking with a recruiter, and that's just a general feel for could this possibly be a good fit, or is the candidate just not interested in what we're looking to hire for. Beyond that, we'll have some technical coding exercises. We may tailor that to the role. If it's a senior software engineer position, we might have 2 coding exercises for you, because we have to know you can write solid, readable code. If it's a more entry-level position, 2 coding exercises might not be the best use of everybody's time. And if it's a principal level role or a tech lead level role, yeah, we want to know you can write code, but we also want to know that you can help others think about architectural problems. And so we also have some interviewing time dedicated towards, people would know of this more as like the whiteboarding problems, although it's generally going to be remote. So we're probably not using a whiteboard, and we change things up accordingly. And then I had mentioned a lot of the, shortly ago, I had mentioned behavioral interviews, and it's not as scary as that sounds. It's just, can I talk to this person and feel confident that they're going to be a good team member? They're going to be somebody who I'm glad they're on the team when we run into this blocking issue next week, stuff like that. And that stuff does tend to feel much more conversational, but there's, there are objective points to it all, and we're not just doing it to waste time.
Yeah, great. And then after that, is it some type of offer, or is there a final conversation or anything like that?
Yeah, every candidate's unique, but hopefully we get to an offer. It's given we'll have open roles, so we also want to make sure that we take time to speak with enough candidates to we don't want to feel like we only spoke to one candidate and, well, they seem good enough. We may want to compare them to a few more. And all this being to say, we may take our time to fill a role, depending on the need and the urgency.
Yeah, that makes sense. In the past, when you've been in technical interviews, doing them yourselves, how do you feel you've performed? Do you like, oh, I smash everyone, or I hate them, somewhere in between? Depends on the interview.
Yeah. I like to think that I perform authentically, and that is to say, if you interview me, you're going to have a pretty accurate idea of my ability and what it's like to work with me. I think all of us, when we started interviewing for our adult careers, that's a funny phrase. Anyways, when we started interviewing for our post-education careers, we think we have to put on this front, we have to put on this mask of professionalism. And I think more often than not, that just means the interview decisions that you get, whether it's an offer or rejection, are just less accurate. And so I just try to put my real self out there. In terms of how I do in the interviews, I've failed a lot of them. And I would say, if you're not failing a lot of your interviews, you're not aiming high enough. If you usually get an offer, you need to be interviewing for a position above what you've been applying for.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I like
It's
that mindset.
yeah, get rejected. You should aim to get rejected often enough that it's no longer scary. It's going to be
Yeah,
painful. It's always painful. It feels like getting turned down romantically. It's just like it hits you right in the heart.
totally.
But it's a good thing. It's a necessity.
Yeah, I play poker, and I will say I bluff a lot when I'm playing poker, to the point where my friends are like, "You bluff too much," and I always tell them, if you don't get caught bluffing once in a while, you're not bluffing enough, right? You're losing hands you
Exactly.
could be winning, right? The same idea. If you're not getting rejected, like you said, you're not setting your sights high enough either. Interviewing with companies that have, maybe less strenuous interviews, which often also means maybe lower compensation, or maybe not as, I don't know, prestigious, maybe the wrong word, but that does tend to be like the harder the interview. A lot of times companies do tend to compensate folks pretty
Yeah.
well. Or like you said, a different level, right? You're looking at SE2s or senior software engineers, or maybe you should be looking at the next step up. It's a really
Precisely.
interesting.
It's if you're not getting, the golden ratio would probably be half offers, half rejections, and you'll never be able to, get that exactly. But that would help you very accurately understand where is your current ceiling in terms of where your career is, and hopefully that improves every year. But if you don't have a good feel for what you're really worth, yeah, you're right. You're going to be shortchanging yourself on title, career, position, comp, stuff that really matters.
Well, and it also helps you know what to work on, right? For if let's say
Absolutely.
in this job search you're shooting for this level, and you only get offers, you don't really know what the next level of interviews is going to look like, right? Once you're level up, if you're doing kind of a little bit of both of those types of interviews, you see, oh, my system design skills are pretty weak. I better work on that. So a year from now, when I go to interview, I actually do well in those, right? And I think that's what's been the most eye-opening for me in the past, where I go, oh, clearly I have this huge gap because I didn't even know this was the thing they were going to ask about, right? But
Yeah.
I don't have to cram that stuff tomorrow. I can learn over the next, 12, 16, 24 months, whatever it is, to my next job search. So then I come in going, oh, okay, I feel pretty comfortable with this, right? They might hit me with some new thing, but hopefully I've got a little bit of an ear to the market and I'm learning those things along the way, right?
Yeah. Yeah. If you're a senior software engineer and you can figure out what is the gap between you and principal software engineer, that's incredibly valuable. Most senior software engineers don't know what that is. And to know what that is means that you could explicitly work towards it. I'm glad you brought up cramming, because I think that's such a good point of I think like academic tests, there's just, you can't do yourself much good with cramming. I recommend folks, instead of trying to memorize some algorithms before an interview, read about the company. When be in a position for when the interviewers ask you, why did you apply for Elastic? What interests you about Elastic? Hopefully you have a really good, interesting answer to that, aside from something that just kind of feels, fluff and made up on the spot.
Yeah.
That goes a long way. And I think that's the most valuable type of, if you're going to do any sort of cramming, that's the type of cramming you should be doing.
Yeah. Well, and there's so much, like if you're trying to cram all data science, or sorry, all data structures and algorithms, the week before your interview, I'd say learn about the company and focus on one thing you're really bad at that you might actually get asked, right? Like if you
Sure.
don't know recursion at all, do a little bit of recursion, right? But you're not going to learn binary trees, linked lists, and everything else all in that week too, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
having something to actually share that you're interested about the company goes a huge way, right?
absolutely.
Do you have any system you use to break down technical questions? Let's say you're in a spot where the company goes, hey, do X, and you don't have an immediate solution, right? How do
Yeah.
you work towards something?
I'd say first off, and this is kind of the inverse of what I was talking about earlier when I'm an interviewer, but as an interviewee, always make sure you understand the question. Don't have like a half understanding of the question and say, all right, I'm just gonna close my eyes and barrel forward. Ask clarifying questions. If this is an interview where you're going to be dinged or looked down upon for asking clarifying questions, you probably don't want to work wherever that happens to be. And asking clarifying questions, aside from the direct benefit of understanding what you should be answering, it also gives you some time to start thinking through, all right, how let those gears start spinning in your head and think, how am I actually going to break this down? Um, uh, and I think what you described, the type of question where you don't have an immediate answer to, you could think about it in two ways. One, maybe that's the point of the question. And the interviewers, they just want to see how do you function in an environment where you don't have the answer. You're probably not going to come up with the answer in the next 5 minutes. Can you talk through what you would do next if you had, a week to solve this problem? Or, we this even comes up in coding interviews, where most coding interviews are designed such that you cannot finish them in the time allotted, which leaves this open-ended question at the end of what would you do next? How would you change your design? And to be able to talk about something where you're not actually coming up with a solution, but you're talking about how you might come up with a solution. I love that because it's parallels real work so effectively. If it is the type of question we're expected to have a real answer by the end of the question, just like real work, try to break it down into smaller problems to solve. This is kind of a bad example because I hate this question, but the like riddle problem solving questions like, how many golf balls can you fit in a 747 aircraft? Don't ask those questions as an interviewer, they suck. But nobody knows the answer to that off the top of their head. And the whole point is, can you problem solve and use estimations to come up with a number at the end that's plausible? But that was the point of the exercise. Can you work under ambiguity?
Yeah, that's a really great. I was just having a conversation yesterday with a recent bootcamp graduate who was, I was trying to frame this correctly. He was basically asking, like, interviewers regularly say they want to know how I think, right? Like, that's the point of the interviews. They want to know how I think. And they want to see like how I'll be able to problem solve on the job. And then they give me an interview question or like an elite code type question, right? And he's like, how do those two correlate? And I was like, they don't always, right? But often there is a point in the question where something is not super intuitive, right? Like you're working through this problem and it relies on some maybe non-intuitive piece of information that you kind of could reason towards if you're asking the right questions, or if you've seen this problem before, right? And that's the piece, like when you get to that and realize, oh, I don't know how to do this, right? Where you go from there is kind of the point of the interview, right? Do you freeze up and go, and you don't do anything for the next 20 minutes, right? And I've done that in interviews, right? Where you just go, I don't really know how to do this, right? Or do you say to the interviewer, oh, I haven't seen something like this before. I'm thinking this might work, but I don't really know how to do that. What do you think, right? Are you having a conversation? Do you work towards Google, right? Like, I think that is often the point of the interview is when you're stuck, what do you do next? Because that is being a software engineer, right? Like that's the part that actually kind of relates to your day-to-day job is often we get stuck and then have to go, okay, do I immediately go ask my lead or do I immediately Google something? Do I play with it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 2 hours, right? Like, what is the right approach for this? And I think that's the piece that is, it hurts, right? Because it's like not fun to be in that spot, especially when someone else is staring at you, waiting for you to come up with some type of answer. But that's often the point of the interview, especially questions that are not FISBAs, right? Or something where you immediately go, oh, I know, right? So it's tough, but it's kind of fun sometimes too.
And you summed up the right approach. You say, I don't know, let's talk through this. That's real work. That's what I do every day. And to see somebody successfully do that on an interview is revealing in really good ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the last thing I'll say is, I also said some interviews you say like, I don't know about this. What do you think? Right. And sometimes they'll, oh, maybe we should Google this, right? Like they'll point you in a direction. I would say maybe 10, 15, 20% of interviews will go, I don't know. And you might just get stonewalled, but at least you've asked, right? You've done the things that you go and like you said earlier, might not want to work with that person because maybe that's what it might be like if you slack them a question too.
Exactly. I was just gonna say, you hear it all the time. You're being interviewed, but you're interviewing this company as well. And if the when you're struggling through a problem, if their response, and maybe for bad, maybe not the greatest reasons, maybe their approach to interviewing is to stonewall you. Maybe that's just the strategy they've chosen. I don't agree with it. But if they're just making you feel that pain in that silent, cold sweat, awful scenario, that might be more signaling than you realize.
Yeah. Well, it's easier for an interviewer, right? Like you said earlier, you should be doing almost as much work, if not more, than the candidate, right, in the interview to make it a good experience. But it's really easy to kind of disconnect and go, I'll lock back in once they actually get close to a solution. Or if they're way off, I might go, hey, that doesn't really make sense to me, right? And then hope they fix themselves, right? It's easier, but it is not necessarily productive, right? And I think that's sometimes people get tossed in interviews they don't necessarily want to be in, right? So I think that's where that may come from. Or you know, we all have bad days. We're busy.
Yeah. I do think interviewing is one of the harder things I do in my day to day. I got to be on my toes. I might be a little wiped out after I interview somebody, and I sympathize with folks that want to just autopilot through an interview, but you're wasting everybody's time. And you know, at the end of the day, you got to think of it as I'm looking for a new teammate to get to work with, and don't shortchange yourself on the ability to get something good out of that process.
So that's a great point. If your interviewer is watching, is this is your potential teammate. I can't tell you how many people I've been interviewed by and went like, I don't really like, if I go work there, I don't necessarily want to work with that person, right? Like company sounds great, but that person, and it might just have been because they weren't that locked in the interview versus, you know, if they were engaged, I might, I definitely want to be on that person's team, right?
And we're like giving them the benefit of the doubt of saying it might be that they just weren't locked in that interview, but this was their one time to show me what it's like to work with them. So I have to use the information they gave me. It'd be a mistake to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, right. Do you have any other tips or advice you would share with folks who are maybe preparing for technical interviews or going into them shortly here?
Yeah, I mean, one of it's a cop out of just do enough of them such that the rejections and failures are nothing more than an opportunity to learn something. It's okay to interview someplace that you're not interested in. In fact, if you're in that you know season of life where it's time for a change, it might not be a good idea to go interview at your top pick tomorrow. Maybe do some practice runs with some, you know, B or C level picks before you really make an attempt with your top choices. I do think it's most successful to just be your authentic self, because that means if you get an offer, you can be highly confident it's going to work out. If you try and put on this front and if you've tricked the interviewers into giving you an offer when they normally shouldn't have, well, gosh, you don't want to go somewhere where things aren't going to work out. That's inconvenient at the very least, if not painful in many greater ways. I think finally, I'd say it's okay not to know the answer. It's okay to ask for clarifying questions. It's the whole point of a good interview is to find to discover the extent of your ability, of your knowledge, find the extent of how you work. And so you're going to run into, I don't know, and it's okay not to know. Provided you then take the approaches we've spoken about recently about talking through problems, even if you just have no idea.
Yeah, that's great. Do you have different advice, maybe separate advice for like early career folks? Maybe this is their first or second job search.
Yeah. So as an early career candidate, one thing you have to consider is the candidate pool is massive. Boot camps have become really popular. For every boot camp graduate that applies for an entry-level position, they're up against dozens, if not hundreds, of other candidates, which might not necessarily be the case for a senior software engineer position. So what I tell early career folks is, well, I should say, here's what I don't want to see. What I don't want to see is the resume that says, I graduated from some boot camp, here are the projects I've done, and chances are I'm going to see other candidates who come from that boot camp or a boot camp like it. And I'm going to, if I see the exact same project listed, all I'm really reading is you did homework.
Yeah.
So do anything you can to show me that you're uniquely talented above your peers, whether that's a side project that you've pursued on your own or any real work that you've done. Highlight that. Most bootcamp programs have that capstone project at the end that was hard and it was a lot of work and it was pretty impressive that you managed to finish it, but every candidate did that, and
Mm.
it doesn't really help you stand out in any way. And so, I love to see early career folks show on their resume or describe to me in person a time when they were fixing something in production, even if production was just their side project website, a time where there was some weird database migration error,
Mm.
and they're not entirely sure what they did to fix it, but they fixed it. Like, I do that every day. That tells me so much about the candidate, more than did they follow some academic curriculum.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I said this before, and I'll probably say it again, but it doesn't take all that much to stay. Like, if you see if the copy and paste bootcamp graduate resume is, a couple previous jobs, the boot camp at the top, and then whatever project or big project they did as their capstone. It doesn't take much more to stand out from that, right? If you also have, oh, here's this other thing. I mean, for me, there's a podcast I have on the side, and I think just that was a conversation starter, right?
Yeah.
For a lot of companies, regardless of it meant anything about my software engineering skills, it was a conversation thing that people could bring up, right? It doesn't have to be something massive, but something that is at least puts you 10% above the rest of the people. When you're flipping through 40 resumes, you go, oh, this is interesting. Let me at least have a conversation with them, right? And like, once you get the foot in the door, then it's on you to prove that, you pass the technical and some of these other interviews. But I think that's what you're fighting against a lot of times, is just to get the phone call, right? That first call.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't take a lot to be kind of just a little bit above the rest of the people to get that conversation.
Yeah, demonstrate evidence that you solved some problem nobody asked you to solve, that you were just interested in some technical project. And even if it's not impressive at all, it doesn't actually solve a real world commercial problem that anybody cares about. You had to write some code, and maybe you interacted with a data store, and it was really hard, and you ran into these problems, and this is how you solved them. That puts you so far ahead of somebody who just solved the problems they were asked to solve as part of a curriculum.
Mm. Absolutely. Well, before we move into our break, and do you have any interviewing horror stories you're willing to share that maybe folks can relate to say, oh, if Ross went through this and you're a successful engineering manager at a great company, that they can be too someday, if even if all things go wrong.
I was thinking about this the other day, and one memory that came to mind, I talked about how going to school where I went to school gave me access to a lot of school internships during the academic year. And I remember going on an interview where I had listed some technology on my resume that had caught the attention of this hiring manager. And so we sat down in person at their office, and they said, all right, I'm going to go down a list of technologies. Stop me when I come across a technology that you have experience in. And about 10 technologies into that list, and I still hadn't said like, oh, I know that one. I started to get that cold sweat. And finally we got to 20 technologies down that list. I still hadn't said anything. And the interviewer said, well, was any of that familiar to you? And I said, yeah, kind of this one thing, but not really. And that was it. I'd blown it, and the interviewer, I think in being kind, said, all right, well, why don't you come back next year? I don't think there's a fit here. I mean, I had essentially had the interview where I'd said, I don't know the answer. And that was my only response to any question I was given. And then I was walked out the door. We all do that until we understand those moments where we should have at least asked a question or attempted to problem solve on the spot. I think maybe more applicable to the pain that folks might be going through today is I've absolutely been in that coding exercise where I've been confronted with an arbitrary problem in a language that I'm kind of familiar with, but not enough to be slick in. And man, I just stared at the exact same problem for about 20 minutes, trying different stuff that was going nowhere. The interviewers were just staring me dead in the eyes, giving me nothing in return. And I think that was how they were coached to behave, which, I've already spoken about how I view that behavior. and it sucked. And I'd flown to this city to interview with this company, and it's just that awful feeling of you like walk back to your hotel and you're like, I didn't get that job. And now I got to hang out in this dumb city I don't want to be in for the rest of the night till I fly home on this stupid plane I don't want to be on tomorrow. And it's if you don't have those moments, you're not aiming high enough. You got to seek out those rejections to get the offer that like is really too good to be true, and not too good to be true, but is worth taking.
Yeah. I don't know if I've told this story before. I flew to Waco, Texas one time to interview with SpaceX, which has an office near there. And I somehow got through the phone interview, right? And I honestly think there was some mistake where like the person who was managing the role went on maternity leave like right after my phone interview. So I followed up and they said, oh, we'll just bring you on site. And I said, okay, sure. I've never been to Waco before. Like, I'll fly in. They got me a rental car. I was like, make a weekend of it, right? And I flew down there and did the first, like, I got there for the on-site. I did the first interview. It was like 30 minutes. Did not go well at all. And then they said, oh, I'm going to go see if this manager is available. And came back after like 5 minutes, said, they can't meet with you. We're all good here. Like, you can go. And I was like, I literally flew all the way here to have like a 20-minute conversation. But, you know, they paid for my Pizza Hut that night, and I got to see the beautiful town of Waco, Texas. And it's an interesting story, right? But not a ton of fun, but a learning experience, right? I'll probably ask what they're going to cover in the interview next time before I fly halfway across the country.
Exactly. That's actually a really good point. You should always ask your recruiters what the interview is going to be like. There's no reason for the recruiter that you're working with not to tell you, because they want you in your authentic way to do well. And that's a really good point. And yeah, you got to take those opportunities, even if you crash and burn. Nobody you get to work with in your career who you might look up to has managed to avoid those disasters.
I think I had maybe one person on the podcast that I asked that question to, and they said, I have had a 100% offer rate. And I said, wow. But then I realized, they'd only really had they'd been at companies for a really long time. They basically had like 3 interviews in their career, and they stayed at each of those companies like 10 years. And I was like, well, I guess that's one way to do it, right? You probably did do really well in all those interviews. Different paths. We'll take a quick break here, and then when we come back, we'll move into the technical.
Thank you for watching the first half of the Professional Technical Interviewee. The technical interview will be released 1 week from this episode, so be sure to subscribe to make sure you don't miss it. New episodes are released on the first 4 Thursdays of each month. Find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Dorsett or on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. And remember, keep practicing.